Hello, everyone. Ooh, this mic is hot. I'm Melanie George. I am Associate Curator here at Jacob's Pillow. And for this week of Camille A. Brown, I'm also the Scholar in Residence, and we often pair a PillowTalk with the programming, and so that also means I get to moderate a talk with one of my artistic heroes, the great Talvin Wilks. Talvin's here as part of our presentation of the exhibition Snakehips in Our DNA, From Renaissance to Permanence. It's a media installation conceived by Talvin in collaboration with video artist LaJuné McMillian, composer Dominique Pereira, and sound designer Kwame. You know what, I only call him Benny. It's so funny to see his full name. Kwamina Benny. I usually just call him Benny. He also happens to be the sound designer for the Jazz Continuum, which is a program I tour with. And so, yeah, there's so many connections happening on this campus this week. I'm going to read Talvin's bio because it's really important that you know who he is. Talvin Wilks is a playwright, director, and dramaturg based in Minneapolis and New York City. He has served as a co-writer, director, dramaturg for Ping Chong and Company's ongoing Undesirable Elements series and 4 productions of Kaleidoscope, Adventures, and Pre- and Post-Racial America. In 2022, Wilks directed the world premiere productions of Parks by Harrison David Rivers at the History Theater in Minneapolis, Minnesota, Cannabis, a Viper Vaudeville by Baba Israel, Grace Galou, is it Galou? Galou?
Grace Galou.
And Soul Unscribed at La Mama Here Arts, and a 3-play saga, the Till Trilogy by Ifa Baeza, thank you, at Mosaic Theater in Washington, D.C. Since 2014, some of his most acclaimed directorial work has been centered at Penumbra Theater Company, including The Ballad of Emmett Till and Benevolence by Baeza, This Bitter Earth by Rivers, The Owl Answers by Adrian Kennedy, and The White Card by Claudia Rankine. His critically acclaimed direction of The Peculiar Patriot by Liza Jessie Peterson is featured in the documentary Angola Do You Hear Us by Cinque Northern and was shortlisted for an Academy Award. He also served as dramaturg for Camille A. Brown's Broadway revival of For Colored Girls Who Have Considered Suicide When the Rainbow Is Enough, and for the world premiere of Dreaming Zenzile by Somi at New York Theater Workshop, National Black Theater. Other dramaturgy credits include Page turn.
Drum roll.
Between the World and Me at the Apollo, Scat, Walking with Train, Hep Hep Sweet Sweet by Urban Bushwomen, Ink, Black Girl Linguistic Play, Mr. Tal Erance by Camille A. Brown and Dancers, In a Rhythm, A History, Necessary Beauty, Landing Place, and Verge by B.B. Miller Company, the go-to dramaturg for all of the great black women in dance. I'm just gonna say that. Wilks is an associate professor in the Theater, Arts, and Dance Department at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, and is a 2020 McKnight Theater Artist Fellow and a 2022 McKnight Presidential Fellow. Please welcome Talvin Wilks.
Thank you. You know what's missing inside of that that's so important? Actually, exactly, Paul. You know, this was also off the Ping Chong list, but I didn't include the playwriting, but co-conceiver and collaborator with Carmen de la Valade in her beautiful piece, As I Remember It,
Yes.
that premiered here. Should be on that list.
I told y'all the go-to. Like, we didn't even get to Diane McIntyre.
There we go.
Okay, so I want to start with talking about the origin of this exhibit and how it actually started from another project that didn't quite get there. Set us up for how we get to this exhibit.
Okay, that's great. Thank you all for being here. Very excited and hoping that you'll get a chance to just sit, meditate, sit inside of the installation and listen to all of those incredible journeys that the artists share in that piece. The piece was originally, I'll stop popping my piece. Originally it was a centennial commission by the Apollo for a project with Little Buck and John Books. And I had been working with them on a new work that they were touring called Love Heals All Wounds. And the Apollo approached us, along with a number of other artists, to create a unique piece for the beginning of their centennial celebration, which was initially going to premiere in 2020. And so we all know what happens to that journey. But the idea was to think about the Harlem Renaissance and present day Harlem inside of a legacy lineage journey in any way you wanted to explore it or interpret it. So we were thinking, what we actually worked on for 2 years was an exploration of their collaboration and thinking of exploring this history inside of the Renaissance as two artists arriving in New York, discovering sort of the jazz age and what was happening inside of art and exploration, and then thinking about their own personal journey and lineage in Memphis Jukin and that life, and John Books is a poppin' locker. So that connection and the way they build work and the way they collaborate was always going to be at the heart of the journey and the collaboration. So we had discovered what we called 4 meditations that we had already started developing. One was a migration journey. The second one was Snakehips, and I'll tell you more about that. There was going to be a Josephine Baker kind of investigation into a final performance. And this was actually going to be a dance performance at the Apollo. And so we worked on that for 2 years and really began to focus on the Earl Snakehips Tucker journey. And they had already started experimenting with responding to, you know, the 1 minute, 48-second clip that we have from Crazy House.
That we'll see shortly.
That we'll see shortly. As well as really thinking about music and a personal journey inside of that history and lineage. Unfortunately, they left the project. You know, I could say it on the record that, you know, that a challenge with our line producers, Sozo, and decided that they didn't want to go further with the exploration, and left me holding the bag, right? So the Apollo was then going to buy my contract out, and then they came back to me and said, well, do you have another proposal in thinking about the work? And working with John Books and Little Buck, I'm already what I would call a collaborative dramaturg director. We are inside of this exploration that we're doing together. We're thinking thematically. I've already done 2 years of research exploration. We'd already begun this way of thinking about Snakehips in a creative format. And so I thought, well, I can carry that forward in thinking about other artists stepping into that same exploration and thinking about their relationship to the Harlem Renaissance. How do they track or sort of thread back their mentors and their inspirations? How far back can they go? How can they build something out of that? So I created this new idea of, and it really came from a quote that we were still working from as we were exploring the work with Snakehips, and Little Buck was actually doing some incredible writing, poetry really, in thinking about what he recognized of himself inside of what we were discovering about Snakehips, and we can talk about that a little later. And that's where this notion that Snakehips is in the DNA of street dance vernacular. I mean, he just claimed it. He said, I didn't know about Snakehips, but I immediately see myself inside of, you know, his performance and his, you know, shall we say, gestural vocabulary. Also, in that, you know, they loved watching this clip in that sort of that sense of his edge and the idea of the aesthetics of the cool that we'll talk about coming up later. There was really an immediate understanding and a connection and a recognition. And that fed the whole heart of the project, which was really about lineage and legacy. And my whole thing was about the notion of from Renaissance to permanence. This idea of we're always discovered and rediscovered. There's always this renewal of an idea, but when do we reach the point when we are permanently embedded in the understanding of the history, period. No more Renaissance, permanence. And so that became the mantra for me in building Snakehips in our DNA, from Renaissance to permanence. And so I proposed that I would identify 8 to 10 choreographer dancers to respond to the clips that we have of Snakehips through their own particular, dance vocabulary, vernacular. And that began the journey of the curatorial process.
So we're going to watch the video shortly, but I hope you'll indulge me for a minute. I'm going to read a little bit from that obit that Brian Siebert wrote. So for those who aren't familiar, the New York Times has been going back and writing obituaries for people who passed away many years ago and were never acknowledged. And in 2019, Brian Siebert wrote one for Snakehips. So I'm just going to read a little bit to give you all some context. This is just an excerpt. It says, Duke Ellington, who hired Tucker to dance with his band at the Cotton Club and elsewhere, once speculated that Tucker had not come from, quote, Tidewater, Maryland, or had come from Tidewater, Maryland, one of those primitive lost colonies where they practiced pagan rituals and their dancing style evolved from religious seizures, end quote. Tucker was, in fact, discovered in Maryland, dancing in the streets of Baltimore, and Ellington's claim is probably accurate in other ways. What Ellington called pagan rituals, scholars would identify as African spiritual practices that informed African American culture. Tucker's trembling was most likely related to dances of spiritual possession, which became part of Pentecostal, sanctified, and holiness traditions. Whatever its source, his dancing was entertainment that played in Harlem nightclubs. When Tucker appeared on Broadway in the all-black revue Blackbirds of 1928, the program described his act as his, quote, conception of the low-down dance, end quote. That low-down quality was in contrast to the upright tapping of the show's star, Bill Robinson. Zora Neale Hurston, in her now canonical 1934 essay, Characteristics of Negro Expression, cited only 2 dancers by name, Robinson and Tucker. She used both as exemplars of the lack of symmetry that makes Negro dancing so difficult for white dancers to learn. What remains beyond these fragmented memories are a few seconds of him at the end of the 1935 musical short Symphony in Black and his 2-minute routine in Crazy House, a comedy set in the Lame Brain Sanitarium. His snaps and claps draw attention to a musicality that runs throughout all his hip rolling, through his every sinking into the ground, and his miraculous, rubbery recovery. He wasn't a contortionist, he was a dancer, one of a kind. Let's go to the video, please.
Can I? Okay, good. All of those elements framed in that article are the ones that we also used inside it, especially the Zora Neale Hurston Characteristics of Negro Expression. It's an incredible, fabulous essay. And for me, pairing that with Brenda Dixon Gottschalk's first premise of an African aesthetic, which is also a wonderful essay that utilizes Earl Snakehips Tucker as this foundational way of looking at sort of 5 modalities of Africanist essence in dance, all framed by what you're about to see, this clip from Snakehips.
I've been looking for you. Doctor, I wasn't looking for you, I'll guarantee you. I want to show you something. What? Look. I'll bet you that fella's mother was scared by a pretzel.
But the thing that you have to do is completely erase that background. Play Snakehips, at the Cotton Club with Duke Ellington's band behind him, and all of that sensual sort of dynamic with East St. Louis Toodly-Doo playing, that's the performance, right? This, and for my captures it as a type of cartoon almost.
Yeah, and so
this is the routine.
I think it's important to note that
it's called. This is from 1930, and it's it's basically like a Marx Brothers-ish travesty, so like a sort of vaudeville romp cartoon of four different. It takes place in an insane asylum. So he's in one of the rooms and is supposed to be crazy. So everyone is crazy inside of this place. But it's just, sketches, skits with these little videos sort of captured. But this is the most extensive record that we have of his routine.
The film's called Crazy House, but that clip is all over YouTube. Very, very easy to find.
But I'm glad we took the clip that actually gives you a little context of what the film actually is, because you can also see the clip with just Snakehips.
I think it's important to note that the thing that you were saying about in this context, Snakehips was characterized as what we call an eccentric dancer, which is not a term we would use now. It's analogous to the way that we had freak shows, and so when Siebert says in that obituary, he's not a contortionist. It's about reframing that narrative around how we even refer to his dancing in the first place. You kind of already touched on this, but I do have my list of questions, so I'm going to ask anyway.
Please do.
And one of my questions was even though we can see how incredible that dancing is, it could have been any artist that you focused on. And I initially my question was it could have been Bojangles in our DNA or Josephine Baker in our DNA. Right. And so having heard the story about how Lil Buck really connected to Snakehips, I'm wondering what it was for you that you connected to in terms of wanting to run with this as a Snakehips project.
Well, I do think, and that's why it is important to tell that origin story. There was something very important about taking this journey with Little Buck and John Boogs in thinking about themselves inside of history and a lineage, because they are both very good in tracing and honoring their predecessors and, sort of lifting up who taught them and who taught them and who taught them. And they had already been doing incredible work in making sure that folks who had originated the formations of even thinking about Memphis Jukin or even thinking about, other formats are recognized and spoken of and are recognized and are, preserved inside of the history. So this really became an extension of that. I think that there was something that they recognized in Snakehips specifically, and in thinking of, not a contortionist, but really a specialized innovation and a unique individualized exploration of that gestural vocabulary and claiming something original and putting your own particular spin on it. That's different than thinking of Bojangles as a, tap dancer inside of that. I think they were excited by a type of outsiderness that's recognized there, but also innovation that's recognized there, that's not necessarily standard or traditional or codified, for lack of a better word, but really the boldness in being your innovative, authentic self, and really daring anyone to challenge that. Like I belong here on this floor show at the Cotton Club, or or on Broadway, or in any of these places, whether you frame me as, you know, a specialty act or however you want to frame that, you know, this is the foundation of my unique artistry, and I think they wanted to claim that as the thread for their form of dancing.
Well, and it feels like lineage shows up as a theme for all of the dancers throughout this. So let's talk about this incredible group of dancers.
Yeah, and then I will say, and so then that's important for me, because
Yeah.
I'm also, a lot of my work is really about, I call it elucidation, you know, sort of in my dramaturgical sort of, you know, Camille knows, working on Pal Joey as a researcher, working on Death of a Salesman. There's a period of time when I've been this dramaturg for hire for these vehicles now trying to frame themselves as, you know, expressions of sort of African-American storytelling. So I come in and help to, I won't say help to, my point is, you don't just do it as an opportunity, you do it because it's actually going to explore or expose or elucidate a part of the history that has been forgotten or lost, or another way of seeing it and understanding it. So that's why I use the term elucidation in these, you know, revised, revamped ideas of vehicles for Black artists. That it's not so interesting to just do it because you can. You do it because you actually are going to discover something important in the history that's either been suppressed or overlooked, that actually sometimes brings a greater truth to the original source. And so that's been kind of a journey that I've been on. And so this connected to that.
Yes, yes.
Yes.
So I'm just going to run down this list of amazing dancers, and I want you to talk to me about these incredible folks.
It was a list of 20 that then made it.
How did you get from 20 to 8? Let's talk about that.
Budget, one. Always those limitations. Availability, interest, curiosity. Kind of, there were some collaborative alignments with LaJuné, and also immediacy. People I know and want it to be inside of this conversation and process. Yes. Yeah.
So I'm going to read. Do you want me to go one by one, or how will this work for you? How would you want to respond?
Go by one.
So,
I think that's a good order, actually.
So the first, the great Mickey Davidson.
Yes. Mickey Davidson was at the top of the list immediately because I actually have a long collaborative history with her because she was a Sun Ra dancer, those of you who know Sun Ra, with Ntozake Shange. They studied at Diane McIntyre's studio together, and I directed a piece by Ntozake called The Love Space Demands that we created. Started the development process in 1990. It premiered in 1992, 93. And Mickey was the choreographer for that project. So that collaboration and partnership, poetry, music, Zaki aesthetic, how Mickey was an interpreter inside of that for a very long time, was at the core of that collaboration and that history. And, you know, she's also an incredible swing dancer, direct in the lineage of Frankie Manning and Norma Miller, has carried that for decades. So, top of the list. I wanted to know what she would bring, and I knew that there was going to be a lineage connection, hopefully at some point, since she could go to, you know, Norma and Frankie. How close could we actually get to Snakehips? So she was a priority, and of course said yes.
Which leads me to the legendary, the ladies' man, Bernard Dove.
Bernard Dove, you see. Mickey brought Bernard Dove. And he, when we're filming this, he's 80 years old. He is, if you see the video, the most authentic channeler of Snakehips. It was in his routine. He came dressed, he wears a silk satin shirt, you know, blue pants, shoes,
I have to say, I've always
hat.
seen him dressed like that. I've never seen him in casual clothes, ever.
Exactly.
Always.
Exactly. you know. And so new legend, but also another connection and lineage. And that was the other part too, in curating it. It had to be intergenerational, it wanted to be multiple forms. So I really did need, you know, I was looking for a grand elder. And so Bernard Dove was that selection.
One of our judges for last night's All Styles battle, the great tap dancer, Michaela Marino-Lerman.
Brilliant, genius. Brought to us by Sozo, because they're actually kind of a tour managing support for Michaela. And, you know, she has the most direct lineage. She was trained by Buster Brown, who worked with Snakehips and told her stories when she was like 7, 8, training, learning. And inside of the, I didn't really know the full stories as we were meeting these folks. But inside of the interview process, the richness of her influences, the copacetics, Gregory Hines, now I won't say the real DNA, but the full DNA aspect inside of this collaboration, and it's extraordinary, right? So, and also a real, the idea of really holding tap down, representing that in this interpretation. When she said yes, that completed, I think, the whole picture.
Ruby Gaskins.
Ruby Gaskins. And this is when you'll start to see how this really was a very personal journey connection. I'd worked with Ruby as part of Urban Bush Women in a piece that they just did called Haint Blue. I was the dramaturg for that process. And she's a house girl. She brings it, she rocks it. That's her language vocabulary. And LaJuné had already worked with her in a previous project. So that was an alliance there. So that, you can see where this is going. This was the curatorial process.
Let's do Rocka James and Drew Dollars together.
Okay, Rocka James and Drew Dollars together. All right. Rocka James, because he was part of a development process for this incredible musical that I directed called Cannabis, a Viper Vaudeville, that premiered in 2022 at La Mama. And that was the piece that you mentioned that was developed by Baba Israel, Grace Galou, and Soul Inscribed, an adaptation of this book, Smoke Signals, about the mysterious journey, the history and journey of a mysterious plant in the United States. And it was truly sort of hip-hop, jazz exploration through covers and original songs all about weed. So, but also about drug laws, drug wars, border patrol, immigration, migrant control. I'll stop there. But the whole full journey that comes through in understanding, laws against black and brown folks inside of the way we incarcerate people around this history of a plant that was medicinal and legal and used in all kinds of sources of sort of medicine and practice. So it was great just to take that whole full journey and watch its impact to the present day. So that's what that musical was about. Rocka was brought to us through that process as a crumper and amazing collaborator. Drew Dollars came from, I know this is taking long.
No, we got time, baby.
Came from Sozo, but they're Flexin, which was the distinction between Flexin and Crumpin, which was very important. And so they were really, and these, what was interesting about these artists is that they didn't know anything about Snakehips. So they were having that similar experience that Little Buck and John Brooks had when they first saw. And you'll hear them in the the installation, you know, sort of Rocca just goes right to it. He says, we do that now. That's this move and that's that move. And it was just great to hear these artists, you know, Ruby does. She says, oh, we do skates, we do glides. I see this, you know, the shaky leg. I see, you know, the boogaloo. All of those things inside of Snakehips vocabulary that they recognize. And that was what I was looking for. It was sort of like, what was the response? What was in the body? What do you see of yourself inside of this video? How can you explore it? What does it mean to put it on? That's what we wanted to capture. And you can see this sort of depth and breadth of the artists that we were curating.
I feel like I know the answer to these next two about how did you find Shannon Judson and Malik Washington? So I'll let you talk about that. But also, if you could talk about the sort of continuum from Mickey Davidson and Bernard Dove as being keepers of traditions with set vocabulary, and Shannon and Malik as being explorers of this movement in the abstract, and how all of that is in a jazz lineage.
Yeah. So Shannon Judge, current co-artistic director of Urban Bush Women, is really, I've worked with the company for over 12 to 15 years, and she was a part of that company for that period of time, and so I really got to know her as a creator, as a maker, and then in this recent piece as a, you know, artistic director and choreographer, and you know, and has all of the, you know, jazz tap exploration aesthetics inside of her body. We had already been exploring and talking about Snakehips inside of our exploration of scat, which was this recent world premiere that Urban Bush Women, we just premiered at Bard this summer. So we were already, and she says we were already in conversation around this particular history and lineage and understanding it. So she was also at the top of the list. And then Malik Washington, I'm introduced by Camille Brown, who's here. And just knowing him as another interesting, you know, mover, maker, choreographer, embodiment. And also all of these people are their own, you know, individual creative visionaries, choreographers, interpreters. And so that was going to be important too. I'm not a choreographer. So the idea was all of this was going to come from prompts, and we were going to explore it and develop it together, and think of it in response to, we had 3 prompts, affirmation, appropriation, and exploitation, which were frames that we had utilized in thinking about what happens to Black artists inside of innovation. And it came from Buck and Books talking about being, you know, being appropriated inside of TikTok and sort of losing control of their own work. And, you know, a person doing an exact routine has 1 million hits and they have maybe 1,000. And so this whole notion of, well, what is lineage and what are we actually talking about in this kind of shared history? We're also talking about the underbelly and the dark side and the challenges of authenticity and all of the questions of, you know, who, not who owns what, but who understands what purely. So all of these artists were inside of their own contemplation around these ideas, and it's what they bring to the room. So they were incredible collaborators, just brilliance in that list.
Which is a wonderful segue into talking about your collaboration with LaJuné.
Okay.
And I'm curious how you came together, but also the approach for you with working with technology and this thing that's so much about sort of this visceral humanity. Right. Tell us how it all worked.
Right. I knew that I wasn't really quite sure what we were making. I had the setup, I had the concept, I had the ideas, I had these questions around, you know, this artistic journey, and in my heart, this real understanding of the importance of the Harlem Renaissance and even the pre-period that leads into the, you know, it's really the new Negro Renaissance or the Negro Renaissance and the whole political idea of the new Negro before it becomes a literary movement. And then how does that propel us into the 30s and then into the 40s? And then, I'm very interested in being a connected artist who understands those journeys and that history. And this, it was of great value to me, a way of me being immersed inside of discovery. And I knew that I wanted it to be a multimedia piece. I knew that there was going to be a visual aspect to it. I wasn't quite sure. And that it was going to be a creative visual aspect. It wasn't going to be a documentary. That there needed to be some type of experimentation and investigation, even in the way that we were going to blend the storytelling and the idea and the history, whether we were going to use text. And, there were a lot of just thematic, theoretical, creative, artistic ideas in that particular search. And so I was presented with 3 artists curated by Sozo, and LaJuné happened to, at this time when I was making the selection, she had been given sort of this special 3-minute clip on Times Squares at midnight when she could take over all of the screens inside of Times Square and, show a project that she had been working on at that time. And that just happened at the same time that we were doing this search. And so I was in New York. I stayed up till midnight. I went to Times Square to have this experience. Ruby was in it. And just the approach and the understanding of sort of a visual, movement-based investigation was already present. And she talked about it. We were meeting with the fellows the other day. She was an ice skater. She has a dance background. So she really has this kind of collaborative, embodied understanding and was already doing her own investigation and thinking about movement, dance, and digital media. And so she became the perfect expression of what I was looking for. She brought the language abstract documentary. That opened up to another kind of important exploration, that we weren't just documenting history. We were trying to, investigate, splice. There's this wonderful thread in the installation that I love that talks about sensuality, that's rooted in a interview with Michaela when she talks about she learned about Snakehips through Buster, and I'm missing Mabel Lee, right, her other mentor, collaborator, and that was right, that there was something that Snakehips lived inside of, that has this male-female sort of sensual, sexual element in it that can be claimed, beyond all of the other words. It's not androgynous. It's not, it's a sensuality, very specifically, that is shared, that she really connected to, and that became a whole sequence and an exploration that I wasn't even thinking about. It came from her. So that's how we started to blend the making of the actual installation. How did the interview inform the visual, the concept, the structure? So that was a bit in the air. And then LaJuné led the way in the technical aspects. She's a fellow at Onyx in New York City. So she has all of this access to studio, to motion capture, and is rooted in that process of making. This is the foundation of her work. And so she just opened that up to us inside of this process.
Yeah. I'm really interested in this exhibit as archive. Mm-hmm. I think for young dancers, so much of the time when they see work like Snakehips, they categorize it as like back then. One of the most horrific things was a student saying to me back in the 1900s. That was absurd, but that's where they are, right? You know. And so I think one of the things that the exhibit does so beautifully is it contextualizes it as being, in some ways, out of time, as being not just timeless, but like the way that Shannon embodies it, takes it out of being rooted to any one time. And I'm really curious with like, what happens with this after like the exhibit run of it, you know, because exhibits don't run forever is really, you know, my question. So I'm wondering, like, is there like an archival thought around this material?
Well, two things that I want to share inside of that. So the original installation was part of the opening week of the Victoria stages, which are the new Apollo Theater stages that they've just created. You know, sort of a 200-seat theater, 99-seat theater, I think. And it was made to exist inside of the lobby, right? And so just as a way of activating that space, and we arrived during the week of Diane McIntyre's premiere, so it was just wonderful and great. Jacob's Pillow came on as co-collaborators, sight unseen, in thinking about this work existing in some way here. And it's really just been an incredible collaboration. I'm gonna throw in that plug.
Go ahead and please plug that.
Because what you'll see inside of this installation is not, you know, was not its original footprint at the Apollo. Yes. It was an imagined new idea inside of this furthering of what's next, where can it go? And we were excited that it really does feel, I wanted it to be immersive. I said I wanted benches because I wanted a Quaker kind of meditative sense possibility. You know, people can come in and go at any given time. And you all gave us this beautiful opportunity to really reshape, reconfigure, and think about what the experience, how the experience can live. So that's part of it. Now we can say it can look like this. This is how it can live. And we did just recently have this meeting about two things. One, the future of the work itself, you know, dedicated website, you know, is there access? But the other part of it, which is really also to my heart, is that there's more interview footage of, when you talk about archive and history, there was a question prompt that I asked each of them to do to trace and step me through your very first, you know, dance class experience. Who was your first inspiration? And take that journey all the way to the present day. So everyone did that. And it's incredible. Just all of these wonderful, you know, Miss Thelma's School of Dance, or my mama in the kitchen, you know, it's just sort of these great things about history, and then incredible overlap, and then, you know, pioneering folks in this room, and people that we acknowledge that are also our histories. So this notion of, you know, archive can also often seem, you know, linear, singular, and this was really quite wonderful because it really, you know, and there's a little dedication at the bottom of my essay, because I at least wanted to speak to the names, the Clark, you know, these different dance centers, these different individuals, names, people that may have been forgotten, who are a part of this lineage and want to be and should be remembered. So we're also now trying to think about another, you know, maybe kind of straight documentary that helps to capture some of those other historical aspects that each of those individuals shared. You know, Michaela's history alone is just phenomenal to listen to, and Mickey's as well, you know, studying at, you know, Urbana-Champaign or Champaign-Urbana, I always get it backwards. Alvin Nikolai, all these folks that I didn't know were, you know, they were her instructors, folks on these walls that she experienced in building, you know, and then she had to create her Black Thing, because that was important at that time. And it's an organization that still exists. So there's this, all of this history was shared in addition to what we were looking for or discovered.
So we're going to take some questions from the audience.
Oh, cool.
I know you all have questions.
Perhaps. How many people have had a chance to see the exhibit? So, yes.
Wonderful.
Yes,
So
yes,
it's just to say, it's running
Cool.
through tomorrow at 8 p.m., I believe. So extensive. You still have plenty of time. It's a gorgeous exhibit. It's in our Sommers Studio, which is the opposite end of campus. If you haven't seen it yet, strongly encourage you to do so today or come back tomorrow. I also just want to name, because I feel like we didn't really say this, the thing about Snakehips is his aesthetic, the way that he moved, is the thing that we credited Elvis Presley for inventing.
Right.
It's the thing that we said Michael Jackson created out of whole cloth.
Right.
You know, it's woven through all of James Brown's vocabulary, and so it's important to not just lift up, but resituate into our existing dialogues and narratives how we got here, because there isn't a forward without the back, you know.
And Michaela does a good riff on that.
Yeah.
Part of it is there, but not the whole sort of understanding of that tracing. You know, it's really very strong.
I think there was a hand up in the back. Yes. Yeah. So the question was about, in hearing us talk, themes, threads that came up were interpretation, channeling, and embodiment. And the question for Talvin was, as that began to become documented, was anything lost? Is that am I right? Am I going the right direction?
One that was connected
about
to sensuality.
How, in relationship to sensuality.
Yeah. And that's the interesting process of interpretation, because everyone received the same interview questions that they answered first, that broke down sort of history, lineage, thinking about what is their first response when they see the video, how does it connect to their own sort of history, lineage. And then inside of the interview process, similar questions were asked. The idea of sensuality was a thematic that came prompted in the conversation of two people, Shannon Judson and Michaela. And so the way they talked about that and navigated that idea, Shannon very specifically talks about a personal idea around sensuality and what the embodiment in thinking about Snakehips allowed her to claim in her body and her practice. So many of the thematics that I structured were actually informed by the way the individuals responded to the questions. So there was I would say, an enriching inside of the initial concept, because they were so incredibly moved in thinking about the idea of that history, connecting to that history, that lineage, and interpreting it for themselves. So they were also, I guess I was a fairly good interviewer. They were very comfortable in stepping into that place. And so the whole process, everyone, you know, they all had like a 2-hour session. They all had already created their first pass at a response to an interpretation of the video that we had. So they already had that in mind. They came dressed. It was in the open, you know, sort of like the color palette they created, and it was perfect. We were like, we didn't even plan this, and sort of look at how that's coming through. Just beautiful. And so they all had a 30-minute interview, and then we filmed them a few times going through their whole routine. And then they put on the motion capture suit, and we shifted into that dynamic, and then we filmed them again inside of that process. So all of those components, resources, then became sort of the landscape for LaJuné to explore and experiment with. And so all of the colorization, the investigation, the way she thinks of avatars through landscape and sort of a visual aesthetic, which is hers. That really is what LaJuné brought to this process. That was did not know where we would be going inside of that. But once I, connected to her, I knew we would be investigating something inside of that idea. And she also took the backdrop. There's that kind of space backdrop with Saturn and stars. That is used inside of the interpretation of sensuality. She wanted to build, retain that. We couldn't get the rights to use any of the video, right? We tried, lots of negotiations, too expensive. So we couldn't even really do a clip or even make an avatar to even sort of approximate. So we could just use still images. So what I would say is people were very open and gracious in that exchange, in honoring someone they didn't even necessarily know about. Some did, some built out, but it was also in honor to other mentors who had inspired them. They were in the room as well. And then they weren't a part of the process of editing, right? I made a very thematic sort of script just from the transcripts, cross-referencing themes, finding connections. Where did we talk about, appropriation? When did we talk about legacy? What else is here? What is this other story? Gems that needed to be heard and expressed really framed the script. And then we did a kind of rough edit of the actual clips that aligned with the script. And then that's when the creative process started, the interpretation of layering images and sort of exploring it through, motion capture and the process. Then we just had modules, and then we were just working thematically on modules and how we had captured, the one, we call it appropriation, in which we're looking at, it's more like a TikTok thing and splicing. Like, that's all the original video that they sent us. They were asked to send a clip from a phone filmed just as an initial type of exploration, and then we used that inside of the journey. Yeah.
All right, another question? Okay, I'm going to try to repeat for the camera. Patsy's so eloquent and my memory's so poor. So the question was about the gaps in the archive when putting something together like this, and the fact that we know that what was captured is a far cry from what Snakehips created in his fairly short lifetime. He died at 31, and how that is a recurring theme in the archives of Black dance, Black social dance, particularly in general. And how did you grapple with the sort of precarity of that?
Very painfully. I mean, that's where, there is this wonderful sequence that we wanted to do called Lineage, but we had a time parameters because of the way contracts were negotiated around editing sound and all that stuff. Crazy. And so that's what we're talking about, that we have these full interviews, and we actually, both Shannon, Michaela, and Mickey, they just kiss Snakehips, and they fill in from the 30s to the present. And so there are names of folks that we have forgotten who are also inside of that lineage. So that's what we're saying. We're trying to, I think that's another thing, that's the wonderful thing about dramaturgy too. Dramaturg is to archive. It's it builds its own, inherent archive inside of the collection process. So that actually is, a byproduct, but can be a thing, that we actually do have things that can fill in the gaps, because they were talking about histories and centers and places where, dance was made that's no longer there. Who was there when they were there? Who did they know? What stories? Much of it, these are stories that I heard. Buster would laugh when he would talk about Snakehips. He would giggle because of just that, the way it was still framed inside of that question of sensuality that couldn't be talked about particularly then, but she can claim it now. And so there's something about what that does to understanding the history that's important, and what can be discussed and understood now that could not necessarily be talked about, but of course was understood then. And so we have a kind of advantage in thinking about that, as long as we don't sort of overinterpret sort of what is there, but bring value to that idea. Yes, Sandy.
Okay, so the question was about all of the other dancers who are also unknown. Specifically, Sandra referenced Shorty George and a film called After Seven, which has some early Lindy hopping in it, and how often in the clips that we have, these historic clips that we have, even if they're from Hollywood films, the dancers are uncredited and we just don't know who they are. And so she was suggesting, Talvin, that you start a whole new project and wondering who's the next one you're going to take on. Go.
I know. And, this came up at the Apollo, and there people had that exact same response with some additional names, and sort of began to think about format and this idea. And that was the hope, even with Little Buck and John Boogs. We said, well, this is just a beginning of an investigation. What could potentially come next? So I'm hoping that there could be a furthering.
If you know a funder, please put them in touch with Talvin. So let me just say, I could listen to Talvin Wilks talk all day long. Like, truly, I love sitting next to a genius. It's my favorite thing.
You're so kind. Thank you.
Like, literal genius. It's 5:00 and we have to wrap up. And so, can you just tell us what's next for you? Like, what else are you working on? Where should our eyes be if we want to follow the genius of Talvin Wilks?
Wonderful things. I have a collaborator here, Paul Berman. I've taken on a new role at Ping Chong and Company. Ping Chong was a great mentor of mine for over sort of 25 years through that. And so I'm part of a new artistic leadership team that's sort of seeing through the transition of, is there a Ping Chong and Company without Ping Chong? And sort of what is that idea? And I'm doing it with, a group of 5, 2 incredible, brilliant, generative artists, Niall Harris and Mayan To. And we're all in the process of building new work in our alliance inside of the legacy. It's like the whole prompt is, how do you move a legacy forward? But you do it through your own original sort of vision and work, your affinity. And so the first piece that I'm developing is called The Truth Beneath. It is an exploration, evocation of a good friend of ours, Maria Ressa, who won the Pulitzer, Nobel Peace Prize for her work with Rappler in the Philippines fighting the Duterte regime. And Paul was the director of her senior thesis, a play called Sagittarius, which was her first exploration in thinking about a Filipino identity and the history, and that connected to the Marcos and Aquino era at that time, and then the current time. And so we're creating a new work, a work that I'm actually co-writing and Paul's directing, as part of what this new idea, new opportunity will be. So we're developing that, and then there's a play of mine that I wrote called Jimmy and Lorraine Amusing, which is about the friendship of James Baldwin and Lorraine Hansberry, that's going to be remounted as part of a Baldwin Centennial celebration at Heartbeat Theater in Hartford, Connecticut. Sort of that's coming up. And I'm working with my longtime collaborator, Aoife Baeza, on a new piece called One Small Alice, which is about a young maroon girl who takes an adventure to freedom. That's a commission with Penumbra and the Children's Theater in Minneapolis. And a new project with Camille Brown.
Yes.
and a next.
Yes.
Sort of with Camille. So I'll stop there, but those are. And the ongoing development of Scat, which will premiere at the Perlman in New York in February. So if you're around, definitely check that out.
I mean, one thing about Talvin Wilks, he's going to stay busy. What's that?
I'm going to hold that.
Okay. All right. Please give a round of applause for the Snakehips in our DNA exhibit and the brilliant Talvin Wilks.
Thank you all. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Jacob's Pillow, for supporting this project and hosting it and mounting it beautifully. Thank you.